and welcome everybody to another episode of Good Writing. I'm your host, Dakota Shane, and today I'm very excited to talk about a short story that has just become automatically one of my favorites, all-time favorites, and one that, while it has been spoken about, there's videos in the book talkosphere and booktuber sphere, I don't feel like in the public consciousness, at least in my opinion, or observation, that this story gets as much credit and love and rereading as it deserves. So I'm very excited to discuss The Jilting of Granny Weatherall by Katherine Anne Porter. And this story was actually sent to me by my dad, who he knows way more about literature than I ever will. That was his field of study and everything, but him and I really bond over short stories and novels and kind of the stuff we talk about in this channel. So he sent this to me a while back. I had never heard about the author Katherine Anne Porter, and I read it and immediately ordered her entire collection and canon as it relates to short fiction. I haven't gotten around to her novel yet, and her essays and journals. And for those who don't know, Katherine Anne Porter was an American journalist, essayist, novelist, really most known for her short fiction, and she actually ended up winning the Nobel Prize in 1965 at the age of 75. So she's very accomplished. She's a Texas woman, grew up in Texas. We'll touch a little bit more about her background in a minute, because I think it's very relevant to the story. But yeah, my dad sent me the story, and I just fell in love with it automatically. And I hope that you either will, if you see this and you haven't read it, or you already have, and that's why you're watching this video. So yeah, let's get into it and why I think The Jilting of Granny Weatherall is good writing. So the story itself is pretty short. In my version here, I have the collected stories of Katherine Anne Porter. It's about 10 pages, and it is a stream of consciousness story of a grandmother, beloved grandmother, who is dying, and she's actually on her deathbed. It's not a first-person narration, but the narrator is very partial to Granny Weatherall's side of the story, and it's just a whirlwind. And through the story, Granny Weatherall starts to think about things on her deathbed, and she's with her family. It starts out with the doctor who's actually operating on her or making sure she's all good at the foot of the bed. And from there, it's just her going through memories and going through not really knowing what's going on in the outside and external world, and it flips from internal and external. And eventually, there are spoilers in this video, so although I don't think that it'll matter either way, I think the experience is in the reading, but just a heads up that there are spoilers. And this leads into this grand crescendo on the last few passages of her dying and her admitting and acknowledging the things that she wants in life and that she wanted in life, and coming to terms that she might have not actually got those things. What makes this even more heavy, in my opinion, and impactful is, as I was reading through Katherine Anne Porter's bio, a few things kind of seemed to connect. And for instance, at 2 years old, her mother actually died, and she ended up moving in with her grandmother, her and her family, in, I believe, a town called Kyle, Texas. And so that's something that I wonder if that dynamic, one, her mother dying, but also moving in and having this motherly figure such as Granny Weatherall in her, so present in her life. Because throughout the story, if you've read it, you know, but if not, it's very clear that this woman, for reasons we'll get into, is a strong matriarch of the family. Very, very weathered, no pun intended, but I'll take it. Very weathered, very strong. So I wonder if that had something to do with this story coming from a very authentic place. Second, Turns out Katherine Anne Porter actually almost died of the Spanish flu in 1918. So as you read through this story, it is incredible how visual and visceral the descriptions are of life and death. I think it's one of the most original and unique depictions of death that almost, when you're trying to fall asleep and you like nod off and go in and out. She writes that so beautifully, of remembering these memories throughout life, and then something will happen in the real world and she'll be right back. And teetering between life and death. I think it makes me wonder that only someone who has been through a near-death experience like this would be able to write it in such a beautiful way. And let me know if you agree, if you've read the story on that. I think it's one of the biggest things that stands out to me in the story. Third, that I thought was interesting is Katherine Anne Porter was actually married 4 times, which, no judgment, and who knows the other sides of the story and everything, but the Jilting of Granny Weatherall, throughout the story, she is trying to come to terms and trying to reconcile with the jilting that happened. So years ago, her love interest, who she was meant to be married with, set to be married with, named George, ended up jilting her, ended up leaving her at the altar. And that feeling is so present throughout the story, so powerful and potent throughout the story, that I wonder how that experience of being married 4 different times impacted the crafting of Granny Weatherall. As such, within 10 pages, actually within 1 page, we'll get into that, you know who Granny Weatherall is. She's a 3-dimensional character. She's a 10-dimensional character at that. But I wonder if that came from a place of authenticity for Katherine. And yeah, so those are some things that I thought were really interesting with diving in to Katherine's actual background. All right, I'm going to read a few standout passages from this story for you, just to give an idea of what kind of writer Katherine Anne Porter is and the caliber that she brings to the table. This is when Granny Weatherall is on her deathbed, nodding off and recalling some memories of her children as she goes through, contemplates life. Here she talks about lighting the lamps, and she discusses that simple ritual and why it meant so much to her. Lighting the lamps had been beautiful. The children huddled up to her and breathed like little calves waiting at the bars in the twilight. Their eyes followed the match and watched the flame rise and settle in a blue curve. Then they moved away from her. The lamp was lit. They didn't have to be scared and hang on to Mother anymore. Never, never, never more. God, for all my life, I thank thee. Without thee, my God, I could have never done it. Hail Mary, full of grace. That image of the calves and their eyes following the match light and lighting the lamps, and them being behind bars like little calves coming in. I just thought that was such a really powerful image. Here's another one. This is when she's actually closer to death, and her family, she realizes that her family has come to her deathbed, and she at first wasn't really sure what was going on. She was thinking, oh, I'm fine. I don't know why the doctor's here. I don't know why the priest is here. And then she's looking at one of her daughters, Hapsy. She seemed to herself to be Hapsy also, and the baby on Hapsy's arm was Hapsy, and himself and herself, all at once, and there was no surprise in the meeting. Then Hapsy melted from within and turned flimsy as gray gauze, and the baby was a gauzy shadow, and Hapsy came up close and said, I thought you'd never come, and looked at her very searchingly and said, you haven't changed a bit. They leaned forward to kiss, when Cornelia began whispering from a long way off, oh, is there anything you want to tell me? Is there anything I can do for you? Just that I never heard of gauzy before, but as soon as she said gauzy shadow, I just immediately thought of, paintings that gauzy haze and everything as we're going out of consciousness. It just painted such a vivid picture, in my opinion. This is another passage. So this is when Granny Weatherall is recalling George, who jilted her. And she is, well, you'll read this. She's kind of sticking it to George in her final hours that I didn't need you. You almost tried to ruin my life, but I'm back on my feet. Yes, she had changed her mind after 60 years, and she would like to see George. I want to find you, George. Find him and be sure to tell him I forgot him. I want him to know I had my husband just the same and my children and my house like any other woman. A good house, too, and a good husband that I loved, and fine children out of him. Better than I had hoped for, even. Tell him I was given back everything he took away from me and more. Oh, no. Oh, God, no. There was something else besides the house and the man and the children. Oh, surely they were not all. What was it? Something not given back. You feel for her so much, and you feel that acceptance, but also the venom and the hurt and the pain in her voice and words. And this is from the last few passages of her actually nodding off. Granny laid curled down within herself, amazed and watchful, staring at the point of light that was herself. Her body was now only a deeper mass of shadow in an endless darkness, and this darkness would curl around the light and swallow it up. God, give me a sign. For the second time, there was no sign. Again, no bridegroom and the priest in the house. She could not remember any other sorrow because this grief wiped them all away. Oh no, there's nothing more cruel than this. I'll never forgive it. She stretched herself with a deep breath and blew out the light. So powerful and so well put in so few words. This experience that is talked about and spoken about throughout society and throughout culture, across cultures, as death and being on your deathbed, it culminates into this climax that leaves you in a state of awe. And so that brings me into my first takeaway of this story. Some things that really stuck out to me. One is the humanity that Katherine Anne Porter discusses here. There's this whole facade almost, or phenomena, that death will be this grand experience for everybody, that death is like birth, and that death will think about our best accomplishments and our biggest regrets on our deathbed. We'll be surrounded by everybody who loves us and our loved ones. What I love about this story is it depicts death as just another day. And I think that's powerful. I think that brings people down to earth a bit, because Granny Weatherall is not discussing these, in the grand scheme of things, massive issues and these things that are just huge stakes. She's talking about seemingly small, and I put it in air quotes because obviously it's huge in her mind and in the mind of us as humans, seemingly small things on her deathbed. You would think that she'd be discussing peaceful things, these happy moments, and instead she's still discussing a jilting that happened to her years and years and years ago, before her kids who are standing before her and everything. And what I love too about this is, or what I think, I'm such a sucker for human characters. I think they're, of course, in the canon, of course, I get the core of storytelling is a hero's journey. But there's something that I love about human characters who are redeemable. Of course, there are things that Granny Weatherall, like, you fall in love with immediately, but also that have qualities because we can relate to not being perfect. And I love that she doesn't forgive George. That is such a scarring thing to have happen to you, to be a bride and think you're going to be with this person forever and you get left at the altar. I really love that. Of course, I would like her to find forgiveness, but I think there's something, what stuck out to me in this story is how beautiful it is that she didn't, and how it was okay, and that she had come to terms. She was at peace with it not being okay. Sometimes that's okay too. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't mean you love that person or that you are like Buddha and just like love everything. It's accepting that, hey, you did a really shitty thing to me, and I don't like you. I don't like what you did. You hurt me really bad. And there's some peace with that, of accepting that. And I think that that is a powerful thing that Katherine Anne Porter discusses here, and it makes Granny Weatherall, in my opinion, that much more human. I also like, too, that throughout the story we hear of Granny's high moments as a mother, and also as in her low moments as a mother. It's clear that there's some tension between her kids. It's not super crystal clear, but she speaks really frankly about how one kid is her favorite, and how she brings up the flaws of the person who's taking care of her, and how she's so complicit that she doesn't like that she wishes she talked back a little more. I'm paraphrasing, but that's what I caught from this. So we see those moments of Granny Weatherall's, Ellen is her name, by the way, Ellen Weatherall, those high and low moments. And again, I just think that there's something so much more. If Katherine Anne Porter would have had Granny forgive George at the very end, it would have been still a great story, but it wouldn't, I feel like it wouldn't have been as memorable. I feel like it would have been just another story about death. I think there's beauty in the fact that on our deathbed, we are going to think of these seemingly trivial moments. More than likely, we're going to think about the things that really stuck in our craw, and hopefully we're going to think about the beautiful moments too. But who knows? We're all human, and we've gone through various experiences. So I love that about this story. All right. Next, we're going to talk about Ellen Weatherall, Granny Weatherall, as a character. So something that I thought was very interesting about this, and why Katherine Anne Porter called it the Jilting of Granny Weatherall, is that last passage. Something that's really powerful is at the very end, she says, "God, give me a sign." And the priest is in her house on her deathbed because she's about to pass. And he doesn't give her a sign. And so she equates it again. I'm jilted again. The priest is here just like it was when I was at the altar. No bridegroom, and here I am. That was a moment, and I'm right back at it. I think that is such a powerful recall and reflection from the beginning of the story to the end of the story. There's parallelism there. Another thing when it comes to Granny Weatherall's character is, in writing, we always talk about how show don't tell. It's the golden rule of writing and storytelling. What I really like about the way that Katherine Anne Porter describes and how we learn about Granny Weatherall is, one, through what she notices, and then two, what she says and how people interact with her. And within the first page, we immediately know who Granny Weatherall is through what she says and what she notices. So on the first page, the doctor, Dr. Harry, is examining her just to make sure everything is okay, and she throws it back at him. She's like, "Get along and doctor you're sick," said Granny Weatherall. "Leave a well woman alone. I'll call for you when I want you. Where were you 40 years ago when I pulled through milk leg and double pneumonia? You weren't even born. Don't let Cornelia," that's her daughter, "lead you on," she shouted, because Dr. Harry appeared to float up to the ceiling and out. "I pay my own bills, and I don't throw my money away on nonsense." Immediately, we pick up on who Granny Weatherall is. I also, on the same, down on page 2 of this, she starts to notice the tonic bottles and the hairbrushes, and that everything Cornelia has set in place and cleaned up. The cinnamon, the ginger, the allspice, the bronze clock, everything is in order. By her noticing those things and by her saying those things, we know who Granny Weatherall is. And I think that's a very great tip for writers. Because a lot of times, especially in such a short time frame as short stories, you have to immediately explain in a unique and novel way who this character is, so the audience can decide how much they love that character, how much, if it's an antagonist type character or a gray type character, how much they relate or don't relate to that character. All of that is important, and this gets accomplished in the first few paragraphs with this story. Another thing that stands out to me too is, as Granny Weatherall as a character, is her late husband. So her husband has passed away a long time ago, and Granny Weatherall even talks about how she wouldn't even recognize John. John wouldn't recognize her, that her kids now are older than the last time she actually saw John before he passed. And she was talking about something that I thought was really powerful and telling, is she was worried about how if John saw her working in the fields, like doing yard work and everything, how that might impact his view of her as a woman. And I thought that that was telling in a way of how she's such a strong figure. She's such a strong character and a matriarchal figure, but perhaps she didn't want to be. Perhaps in another world, if John was still around, he would have be like, cool it, I'll take care of it. And how she longed for that, and how she really misses and loves John and longs and grieves for the life that she could have had with him. All right, the next thing that I think Katherine Anne Porter just does an amazing job of here is the writing of death. So this is one of the most unique, original, and powerful depictions of death I've ever read or consumed. And I think the reason why is because of the teetering between Granny knowing what's going on and Granny not knowing what's going on. Earlier on, or about middle of the way through the story, she talks about how something will have to wait for tomorrow. As she's on her deathbed, she teeters between awareness that she's dying and awareness that she's not. So on the same page here, these two things happen. Sometimes she wanted to see John again and point to them and say, well, I didn't do so badly, did I? But that would have to wait. That was for tomorrow. She used to think of him as a man, but now all the children were older than their father, and he would be a child beside her if she saw him now. So such a sad picture and everything of that, but she talks about how that'll have to wait for tomorrow, meaning she's going to see him in the next life. So she's aware of that. And just a paragraph or two down, she talks about, no matter if Cornelia was determined to be everywhere at once, there were a great many things left undone in this place. She would start tomorrow and do them. So she's talking about how she's going to start, Granny Weatherall is going to start fixing up this place. There's a lot that's left undone here. So she oscillates back and forth between I'm going to die and, oh, well, I'll just do that tomorrow. And I think that that's a really powerful way to write about death. Another thing that pops in, I don't know if you've noticed if you've read it, but the repetition of floating and light. So those two images really stuck out to me throughout the text, of how the doctor floated up to the ceiling, how people were floating around, and this is a blurriness of consciousness. And also light. So she talks a lot about darkness throughout the piece. She talks a lot about lamplight, lighting the light, the passage I read in the beginning. And then at the very end, she talks about blowing the candle out. So she lets herself die and blows the candle out. The repetition there and the images of floating and light, I think, also make this text so sensory. It's such a sensory and not hard to read. It's a stream of consciousness story, but the images that are painted, it's really like a painting. Also, too, towards the end, it almost reminds me of the movie. I don't know if any of you have seen that movie, the Dad or the Father, I think it's called, with Anthony Hopkins. Basically, spoiler alert, fast forward if you don't want to hear it, but he is suffering from dementia and memory loss, and throughout the story, it's from his vantage point. So characters who you thought were his daughter and everything appear out of nowhere, and people who say that they were living with him come out of nowhere, and then they disappear and everything. And so it's actually from the perspective of somebody who would be suffering that, of how it is. And I see that here, the same devices of, at the very end, she was like, oh, I was only asleep for a few minutes. And Cornelia, her daughter who's been taking care of her, is like, no, it's actually nighttime, Mom. Everyone's here to see you. And she looks and she sees her kids around her deathbed, and she sees the priest there on her deathbed. And I think that the emergence, the floating, the appearing out of nowhere makes this such a powerful way to describe death. I also, too, feel like it's a subtle tool that Katherine Anne Porter uses, and it's just about the reversal of roles. So Cornelia, her daughter, is taking care of her, and they're having a conversation. Cornelia, Cornelia! No footsteps, but a sudden hand on her cheek. Bless you, where have you been? Here, Mother. Well, Cornelia, I want a noggin of hot toddy. Are you cold, darling? I'm chilly, Cornelia. Just that darling. It's as if they switched roles, and that's something that I think is beautiful, but also really tough as our parents get older, how the roles switch. You know, not to be, I don't mean this in a negative type of way, but everywhere from taking care of them to helping them go to the bathroom, everything, you become the parent in that sense. And I think those little sprinkles of subtlety there for Katherine Anne Porter just help create such a realistic portrait of what this could have looked like. Another last thing here is short stories have been deemed by some authors as little slices of life. And I think that it's one of the reasons I love the art form so much. I love all art forms. We're going to discuss all types of art and writing and mediums on this channel, but I do have such a soft spot for short fiction and short stories. And I think that the Jilting of Granny Weatherall is just such a perfect picture and example of little slices of life, and just something that really stood out to me throughout this story. So that is my takeaways from this. Please let me know yours if you've read this story. Please let me know if I hopefully sold the story enough, and hopefully we learned some things throughout the way of why this is good writing. And we end every episode with a very optional exercise that applies some of the principles that we learned throughout the discussion. So I want you to set a timer for 10 minutes, and instead of writing death from the perspective of Granny Weatherall, I want you to adapt and adopt Granny Weatherall's voice and write about her being born. What are the things that she would notice? What would the narrator say? But write in the same style that Katherine Anne Porter, to the best of your ability, and write about Granny Weatherall and about the life ahead of her. I think it's a fun exercise. I tried it myself before this episode. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for watching. Wherever you are, whoever you are, I hope your plate is full. I hope your heart is light. And I hope before we speak again that you get lost in some good writing. We'll talk next time. Thanks. Also, I want to ask, if you liked this video, if you're liking this video, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and leave a comment. It really helps the discoverability of the channel, and it would mean a lot to me. Also, if you want to stay connected, if this is of interest, if you want to share good writing together, please follow the link in the description to sign up for my newsletter. Thanks, everybody, and we will talk soon.